Good evening, everyone. Welcome in Arminius. My name is Ernest van der Kwast. I'm the organizer of the series Boek Meester, which welcomes internationally celebrated authors. We're very happy that Reni Eddo-Lodge is our guest tonight, and we're happy that you have come here as well. When we started this program, Boek Meester, in 2016, there were hardly any international authors who came to Rotterdam. To listen to Booker Prize winners and Nobel laureates, you had to leave the city and go to Utrecht, The Hague, or to Amsterdam. But tonight, Reni Eddo-Lodge's only Dutch appearance is in Rotterdam, and the audience has come from Utrecht, The Hague, and Amsterdam, and even Antwerp and Groningen. We are very grateful, and it demonstrates just how important the subject of the book is: structural racism, a suffocating blanket of power that envelopes everything we know like a snowy day, as Reni Eddo-Lodge writes in her book. I am also very pleased that Nancy Jouwe can be with us tonight. I have asked her as an expert on women's rights and ethnicity to interview Reni Eddo-Lodge, and I hope that it will be an inspiring encounter. There will, of course, be opportunity for you, the audience, to ask questions at the end of the show, so make yourself heard. Why I'm no longer talking to white people about race is an important book in a time of growing inequality and segregation. A book that has an impact on readers, that gets them thinking and that provokes them into action. It is an honor to introduce Reni Eddo-Lodge and Nancy Jouwe. The floor is yours. Give them a big applause.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Can you hear me? Oh, you can. Hi, sis. Okay. Welcome, everyone. It's a the lights are a bit over the top, so I can't see you all. But you're here. And you're here.
I am here.
Reni Eddo-Lodge.
Hello all. Hello.
Yes. All. Okay, let's right away check the room. Who has read the book?
Okay, we've got about maybe half.
Half. Okay, who has read it in English?
Okay.
Who has read it in Dutch?
I mean, it only just came out in Dutch, so no pressure.
Did you notice that the title in Dutch and English is different? Yes. We'll talk about that. Of course you did.
I mean, I don't think it's that big of a deal, but okay.
It's not. But it's good to note, right?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Welcome, Reni Eddo-Lodge.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone, for joining me this evening. You know, it's a Friday night. It's Friday.
It is.
Yeah, so you could be out raving, partying.
Shops are open till 9 here,
yeah.
so
I appreciate
the room is filled. It's quite
you've
amazing.
You've chosen to spend it with me. I appreciate that.
Okay, well, so Reni is a London-based award-winning journalist. She's written for the New York Times, The Voice, The Daily Telegraph, The Guardian, The Independent, and so on and so forth.
I have done a lot of freelance work.
And you've won some prizes.
I have,
been nominated as well. And this is your first book.
It is my first book, yes.
Was it kind of a fluke? Because you were writing a blog, and then suddenly it became a book.
Well, I think that's a little simplistic.
I know, and you're going to explain to us how that all came about. So 2014, the year is 2014. You're writing this blog with this now famous title. Why the blog? What was happening in your head or in your life?
Let's go way back. I've always written.
Right.
Even before the internet existed, I wrote diaries. I've always been a reader and a writer, and I've always used writing as a way to process my thoughts around stuff and to really find the right words to explain a feeling or an emotion. I don't know if anybody used to be on MySpace back in the day, but for me, processing my feelings through MySpace bulletins when I was a teenager was something that I did a lot, and so blogging was also natural to me as I became more, I think, politically active and interested in the world and, concerned by what inequality looked like. And so I had been involved in sort of activist environments for, a good few years before I wrote the blog post, particularly in feminist groups. You know, I started to get involved in feminist activism when I was about 19, and I found that it happened to be that the most prominent groups were, you know, tend to steer towards being overwhelmingly white women, and I never really thought that was an issue. I never thought there was a point of difference between me and those women until I started to talk about racism and how it affected, you know, society, my life. You know, I tried to point out racist narratives, you know, in the world, in the media, and I'd also tried to challenge some of the priorities of these feminist groups, and that's when it became clear to me that there was a difference between me and these women. You know, I thought that challenging racism was as much about the feminist project as anything else, and these women didn't. They thought that these things were separate, to be sort of like pushed to the side, something that we shouldn't really be discussing, and I was, you know, told that this isn't something that's relevant to us. Mm-hmm. I remember being at like a feminist organizing meeting, and there were like these little paper sign-up sheets, mm-hmm. and I used to be involved in this group called Black Feminists, and there was a sign-up sheet for us, for, you know, Black feminists, for any woman who defined as Black who wanted to speak about both racism and sexism. And I remember seeing that somebody had taken it upon themselves to write the word "why" with a question mark on that sign-up sheet. And I think that like exemplified a lot of my time in those feminist organizing groups. It's like I was around these white women who were like, yeah, sexism is bad. We can see a clear power dynamic when it comes to gender. But when you tried to point out a clear power dynamic when it came to race, they were like, sorry, we just don't think that doesn't exist. That's not an issue here, and please stop talking about it. Mm. And,
did that surprise you at all?
I think, yeah, it was like incredibly disappointing.
I guess you were hoping for a little bit more empathy there.
Yeah, you know, I think, you know, I'd been on board with their campaigns because it affected me as a woman, and I thought that I was involved in this.
So basically you're saying, I got the gender thing, they didn't get the race thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So it became a pattern. Every time I tried to point out the problem, they told me that I was the problem. Mm. And that sort of like escalated into a situation that I speak about in chapter 5 of the book, right, which I'm not going to go into detail because if you want to know, you have to read it. And a month after that, I wrote the piece, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. It was me making a decision for myself, drawing a boundary for myself that it was for my own well-being and my own mental health and my own peace that I had to stop doing this. And I tried to articulate the reasons why.
Right. And so the paradox being, in a way, you're saying yourself, so I had to draw a line, mm-hmm. as a strategy of self-care, if you will. And at the same time, it's started a conversation where people noted you in ways maybe that they hadn't before.
Yeah, I mean,
because the response was immense.
It was indeed, but I think that the conversation is different now. It's not happening on the terms of white fear and projection and fragility. It's happening, you know, what I wanted is for that conversation to happen from a point of like, let's talk about the material, like, inequalities, the structural biases in like education, employment, healthcare, housing, higher education. Mm-hmm. That's where I think the conversation should start. And I think that so often the conversation about what racism in society looks like starts on the terms of white people who feel very threatened by the conversation. And so for me, I was trying to set the terms of the discussion with the book.
Right, right. And so we'll definitely talk more in depth about whiteness, white privilege, and the like. But before we go there, just quickly going back to the feminism, because there's different chapters, and you were referring to the feminism question.
Yeah,
feminism
5,
question
yeah.
is chapter 5, but it was the first sort of chapter that you actually wrote.
It is indeed, yeah.
Because that was the thing that was kind of bugging you the most, or the thing
you know,
had the
I'd been a feminist activist,
right?
And the movement kind of turned on me when the more I spoke about racism, the more I was pushed out of it. So that was something that was that deeply affected me, and something that I had to write that first before I could get on to writing the rest of the book.
Gotcha. And so, would you still consider yourself a feminist, though?
I mean, I think feminism is always going to shape my values. Being a person in this world, being a woman, being somebody who's been raised to, you know, for better or worse, and I don't think it's with bad intention by, my family and the people who love me, but, largely being encouraged to be an accessory in a man's life. One of my favorite quotes is from the singer Cher. She says that...
Oh, she was here just this week.
Really?
Right? Yeah.
Well, Cher, there's this great interview from her, like a couple of decades ago, where she says that her mum always used to tell her that, when you grow up, you should marry a rich man. And she responded and she said, "But Mum, I am a rich man." And I strongly resonate with that.
Oh, great.
I really do. I have always had a deep sense of antipathy and resentment towards any suggestion that because I was born into this world in a female body, that my sole usefulness in life is to be a wife and a mother. And I'm not denigrating that work. I'm just saying that I think that they shouldn't be the only choice for women. And I full body cringe whenever, elderly relatives tell me, doesn't matter any of this work you've done, when are you getting married? Because that is your
sole purpose in life.
In life as a woman. If you haven't succeeded in doing that, then you haven't succeeded. It's always the aunties who say that are always locked in unhappy marriages, so I don't understand why they say they want me to share the misery. Anyway, that's another matter. So...
But are they also proud, your family? Because it's a huge success.
Yeah, I think my family are proud, but I think that, when I speak about those elderly relatives, they're coming from a context... so much has changed for
They come from another life.
For access for women, since those elderly relatives were my age,
right.
That they are really coming from a context for which, marrying a man was how a woman got social status in their society, Right. And so I treat those people with compassion, and I don't berate them. I just feel thankful that I've born into a world with more opportunities, But despite the fact that there's been access, I have had more access to opportunity. It's like the novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says, we still teach girls to be in competition with each other over men's attention.
Right.
And that's something that I've always felt keenly, and I've also, I think, as soon as I hit puberty, felt keenly that that I should be grateful for men's attention, and that men would choose me and I wouldn't be able to choose them, and essentially that I was going to be a decoration or a background character in somebody else's life because I'm a woman. And as long as those values exist in the world and are still being essentially imposed on women and girls, I'll always be a feminist. Feminist values will always shape my life, because I just value my autonomy too much, and I think despite that, am I involved in feminist activism and organizing in the way that I was when I experienced those huge disappointments that led me to write the blog post? No. I think that I can still be, have feminist values and have those feminist values inform my writing, regardless of whether or not I'm actively in the struggle with white women who call themselves feminists. And at this point, I kind of feel like a lot of their work, I feel like the world's moving on from that kind of capital W white feminism. The world's moving on. We're thinking about things in a much more holistic way in terms of what it means to be a woman, what discrimination looks like when it's aimed at women. So yeah, but I'll always consider myself feminist. There's no doubt about that. Until I can walk down the street and not be street harassed. And
right.
The day that my elderly relative stops saying to me, "When are you going to get married? Please get married now," I'll be a feminist.
Clear. Which also beautiful long answer, and it also shows why this book is also so rich. And what I really appreciate about it, and it's gotten a lot of accolades. People are saying blistering, the Black British Bible, essential, Marlon James, searing, the book that's changing how we talk about race. These are some of the accolades that have been coming out. Indeed, it is a book about race. What I really appreciate about it is that for once we're not hearing again from the US dominating very much the rhetoric around race and politics and everything that's involved. It's clearly situated in Britain, but it resonates internationally, and that's the powerful part of it, which I think is also very important for us here in the Netherlands as well, because in a way we've just started a more public conversation, if you will, about race, and a lot of people do not have the idiom, the language yet to have an informed conversation. So I think your book very much helps us there.
I kind of think it's a bit of a sorry state of affairs. I mean, that my book about Britain resonates with people in mainland Europe and people in New Zealand and people in Australia. It sort of like exposes to me that like we've become so accustomed to the United States having a total monopoly, not only just like conversations, topics to do with anti-racism, but all of our culture, film, television, books, music. Like we're so like used to a United States like perspective on things that like when I come out with something that still is incredibly local, I have people around the world who also look to America for leadership on and anti-racism thanking me. That really like exposes to me like a real deficit in each of those countries to like have an honest conversation about what racism looks like in their own localities, you know. When I was in Australia, I started to feel a little like a fraud, the way that I was being, you know, welcomed by, you know, Aboriginal Australians and like anti-racists, because I was like, it's really bad. I find myself like coming in as a foreigner to these contexts and being like welcomed and knowing that there's probably somebody equally as talented with an amazing narrative to share that whose work hasn't been published in that country. Right. You know, I don't want like the celebration of my work to slot in and just like replace the celebration of you know, African-American writing. Right. Like, I think like we need a multiplicity of voices, you know?
Absolutely, yeah, and it could also be a pitfall, like if someone from abroad says it, we can accept it better than someone
I do think that I benefit from that an awful lot, you know, when I travel with my work, you know, like, and I don't like the idea that me saying it gives it an air of legitimacy. I don't like that.
Right. At the same time, your book came out, it was 2017, right? So 3 years after the blog, which is around the same time that in the Netherlands we had 2 books coming out, both from black women, talking about whiteness. One was, of course, Gloria Wekker, White Innocence. I think it came out in 2016 as an English book, and then a year later as a translation in Dutch. And also Anousha Nzume, who wrote Hi, White People in Dutch, which is kind of a White Innocence for Dummies, if I can put it very simple. And I checked this with Anousha, she's okay with that. Okay. But no, but really, for the first time, really trying to open up a conversation. Both have been attacked heavily. Gloria Wekker has been called a fake scholar because of it, and all the other stuff that I'm not going to repeat. At the same time, she's become sort of a superstar overnight, in a way maybe similar to you. It was time maybe to have this conversation a little bit more. For us in the Netherlands, whiteness is a relatively new concept. White people feel very uncomfortable about it. We're all saying, well, let's start getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? But what you've been doing, I think, is sort of lies in between what Nzume and Wekker have done, in the sense that it's very well researched and yet very, very accessible, whereas people find Wekker's book often maybe a little bit too academic. And let's dive into that book a little bit, because...
Okay, I mean, you know, there's a reason I didn't go into the academy, and it's because... You know, the whole point of the academy is to, like, keep knowledge behind a paywall and make the language as like difficult as understand as possible. And so if you want to try and buy an academic's book, sometimes it costs up to £80.
True. No, yeah.
And I want my work to be accessible to people, you
Yeah.
know, so I want people to be able to walk into the bookshop and buy it. You know, sometimes you can even get a deep discount for like under a $5. But
There
like,
you go.
I'm trying to change the world here, so
One book at a time.
I'm not really
Yes.
interested in having it locked behind lock and key. You can only get it from the university library, and you need to give a lock of your firstborn child's hair and your eBay password. And
There you go.
I'm not into that. No shade to people who are in the academy,
Exactly.
of course,
What I appreciate as a historian is your first, your historical piece. You've done a lot, and I appreciate all the notes also that you have in the back of the book.
That's because I think, like, as an activist, I was just like so attacked all the time that I was like, you know, I felt the burden of proof, you know, to
Exactly.
yeah. But, you know, I also come from a background of journalism as well, so like fact checking, I was like very familiar with that.
But journalists never put notes in, right? And
yeah,
you
but
did.
you know, just because I didn't want to go into the academy didn't mean I wasn't reading academic writing. So it's kind of like a hybrid of like blog, journalism, academia, you know. But that's kind of
I think
my
that
writing
makes it
style.
stronger also.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. You've done a lot of research on really interesting case studies. We're not going to tell all the tales because that'll spoil everything, but maybe we could give a example. But it shows a real black British history. And you also make the case, basically, that, well, let's talk about a civil rights movement in the UK. There was one. And why don't we know this? And in a way, a lot of the stuff that you unearthed was unknown to you as well, right?
Not unknown, but rather these are things that I knew anecdotally that I'd heard.
Rather than
But,
having
you know,
the
they
deep-
weren't taught to me in school.
Right.
So
Okay, who told you these stories?
oh,
Where
well,
did
I
you
used to work at an anti-racism think tank, so, you know, I'd hear about
They'll
those
pop up.
things. Yeah, I'd hear about them in those
but how
contexts.
did
And then
you
also
do-
just, I grew up in Tottenham as well, so
Right.
I just looked for the evidence of the things I'd heard anecdotally.
And so how did you do your research? Because partly you're interviewing some people, but you've also you dove into archives as well.
Yeah, so it was three different ways.
Yeah.
One, the first way, like, so for example, when I speak to John Fernandez in the book, who tells me some really interesting stuff about when he was active in civil rights in the 80s.
Yeah.
It just so happened that I knew somebody who knew somebody through activism who had his number. And I just like called him and said, oh, would you be willing to talk to me about it? And that was great, you know. Yeah. And I think I found him through Amrit Wilson, who had written books about Asian women in the UK. And just through like my time in activism over the years, I knew people who knew her, and she put me in touch with John, and that was great. And I think that's through just like being around in activism for a few years at that time. It's not like I was going in cold. And then the next two things that I did was that I went through the archives. Mm-hmm. So I went to the British Library, and because they've got like a copy of everything that's ever been published. So you just type it into their database, so like a broad search term, and everything will come up.
Was it easy to find this stuff, or was it deep digging?
I had some leads through anecdotes, and like conversations with people, so I just found the leads. The thing is, the British Library is that you can't take the books out, so you have to go there really early in the morning and sit there all day and read. And you're allowed to take pictures of, pages, but you're not allowed to photocopy. That's a little too granular detail, but anyway. I also went to the Black Cultural Archives, which at that point was fairly new. I think it only opened in 2015 or 2016 in South London, in Brixton. Right. And they also had like loads of archive footage and like documents of a lot of the stuff that I'd heard anecdotally. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I just, again, poured through their archives with my leads. It was funny, actually, because the Black Cultural Archives research, like reading rooms, there's only space for like 8 people. So, I'd book in and I'd let them know that I was there researching for a book and stuff. But most of the people who were in there who were like doing research were students. And they kept asking me like, oh, well, what university did you go to? And I was like, wow, my skincare routine must be really working if they, if they think that I'm studying. I was like, no, guys, I graduated years ago. I'm researching for a book. Yeah. So that's basically what I did.
Okay. But you also interviewed some people.
Yeah, I interviewed people. I also tried to find people to interview through the leads that I found in the archives, but that was super difficult.
Yeah.
There was, so for example, the Newer Monitoring Project, whose report from 1984 that I cite in the first chapter, they were still going when I started to write the book, but by the time that I had reached out to them to speak to them for, the book, they were defunct. They'd been defunct for only a few months, and it was like really heartbreaking. I mean, when you think about like the wealth of knowledge there that is gone through just a lack of funding, that was certainly a learning curve that I found when I was researching the book, that just, archiving is important, and, we have loads of people who were there during those times who
are still alive now.
Yeah, not only still alive, but due to like a lack of funding and like economic marginalization, do not have legacy organizations to uphold those memories and are just working normal jobs like everyone else.
Right, yeah. Well, Thatcherism, that kind of thing didn't help either, probably. As it did here, a lot of stuff that happened in the 80s and the 90s that got sort of budgeted away. There was no budget anymore for things, and that sort of really destroys an infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in the book, you also talk about what you mean by black, or you also define black versus people of color, and you also talk about politically black, right? Which is a term from the 80s. Maybe just for the audience, just to reiterate how you define that.
So
those terms.
In the 80s, like in the trade union movement in particular, black, capital B, was used in a political sense essentially to mean not white. Right. So it didn't necessarily mean that you, came from an African or Caribbean background, but rather that you were not white. That's what I would say. Yeah.
As a rallying.
And a lot of the documentation that I was reading from the 80s and 90s use that terminology. So if I was to quote it verbatim and directly, then I had to also define what that means, because it's not really in use anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and in the book, you then, after sort of your explaining the history and giving us some really, really awful examples also of how a structure is in place, you also introduce structural racism as a term, a notion of a system, explaining then white privilege. Could you help us with what you mean by structural racism? What is it to you, and at least also in an English context?
Well, I think for me, this is really informed by my time as a feminist, and my time seeing how it seems like at every level of society, things are organized in such a way so that it just makes it a little bit more difficult for women to thrive, And it became quite clear to me, particularly when I was working at the anti-racism think tank and, pulling together all that data that, I cite in the book on, drastic structural inequalities in, healthcare, education, employment, and housing, that something similar, if not the same thing, was happening, So I cite evidence like the Department for Education in the UK had found in some research that black children about age 11, when they're doing exams to get them into secondary school.
The SATs?
I call them SATs, but, were being marked down by their own teachers and got higher marks by people who,
we have something
didn't know
similar
them.
here.
Yeah. And, that kind of disparity continues, not just from age 11, but right up to when you're an adult and you're trying to get a job. The Department for Work and Pensions in 2009, they did this study, sent out 2,000 CVs, some with African and Asian sounding names, some with white British sounding names, and they found that if you had an African or Asian sounding name, you were far less likely to be called to interview, even though you had, similar qualifications and experience, So over and over again, I would find that evidence, and I don't think that the teachers marking those exams are people who are like, I'm a racist, you know? And neither do I think that the people in HR departments are like, I'm racist and proud, you know?
Right.
Yet the disparity continues,
Yeah.
like the drastic structural inequalities continue, almost as though like it doesn't really matter if you consider yourself to be a good person or not. There are deep-seated biases that you have to challenge to be actively not racist, right? That's what I mean by structural racism. There's a difference between like interpersonal prejudice and a kind of like bias that simply by who holds it literally interrupts other people's life chances, because there's a difference between having interpersonal prejudice and not being in a position of power, and have interpersonal prejudice and being in a position of power. So if you have that prejudice and you're marking children's exam papers, or you're a teacher, or you're a landlord, or you're an employer, then that prejudice will get in the way of someone's life chances. And ultimately, like, structures are made out of people. You know, that's a quote from a friend that I cite in the book. Structures are made out of people. You know, I think my aim as an author is to try and, like, interrupt that some people like to call it unconscious bias. But, like, my aim is to interrupt that and to challenge that at its core, right? So that's what I mean by structural racism. I mean that those drastic disparities in the institutions that we expect to treat us fairly continue to exist.
Yeah. You also you talk about the school system, you talk about black men being disproportionately unemployed, so you also bring some quantitative data here. You're also talking about the mental health system and how that actually mistreats people of color and black people on the basis of their skin. All these examples you mentioned, but you also mention popular culture, of course, because that's a way where these ideas are being reproduced very clearly, maybe subtle ways, but nonetheless, symbolic violence that seeps through that works has an enormous impact. So you're describing this range of both social and cultural issues, I would say. And
and economic, you know, and there's that chapter particularly about housing and class.
Right.
For me, I wanted in the book to really like illustrate how all-enveloping and pervasive this problem is, you know?
Yeah.
I just came across too many reports when I was a journalist that pinpointed, oh, there's a problem in that sector, there's a problem in that sector. And after you start to see that over and over again for 5 years, you're like, oh, hang on a minute.
Yeah,
I think
wait
the
a
problem
minute.
is broader than all of those sectors, and maybe we need to sort of join the dots together.
Yeah. And you also very clearly mention whiteness as something that is a political ideology.
Yeah, I mean, this talk about like whiteness, and for me, I guess I'm trying to talk about an ideology here, you know. I'm trying to talk about an ideology in the same way that we would talk about capitalism or like neoliberalism as an ideology. And I think that like if we can see it as a political ideology, then we can also begin to critique it as such, you know. So I want to talk about like the ways in which it like that ideology, when we accept it uncritically, gets in the way of people's potential, you know. Materially keeps people unemployed or underemployed or trapped in the criminal justice system or more likely to be criminalized in the first place. You know, there's research in the book from the drugs charity Release that shows that, you know, black people are far more likely to be criminalized for like marijuana possession in the UK despite white people using it at higher rates, you know.
Yeah.
And to me that's a symptom of an ideology.
Right, yeah. And it also is materialized in how our political system is organized, I would say, right? You have Boris Johnson right now. You have maybe a Brexit happening or not. That's maybe a very sort of extreme example of politics right now in Europe. But I would say it's all over mainland Europe right now as well, right? I mean, right-wing voices becoming stronger and stronger. And what you did is you're going from system to white privilege to fear of a black planet, where you actually try to explain that people, white fear, as it were, where you interviewed Nick Griffin. And
well, I wanted to interview Nigel Farage, but he wouldn't talk to me. So
that's a shame. Yeah,
I know. I don't know why. Maybe Snowflake doesn't want to.
But Nick did answer the phone, right? Yeah, and he's a little bit like our Gusters. What's his name again? Constant Gusters, right? The Volksunie.
Oh God, did you really have to put that up there?
Well, this is how Nick Griffin looks like, and we can maybe.
Please, guys, thank you.
That was Nick. So tell us who Nick is.
Oh, well, he was the leader of a far-right party called the British National Party that was super influential in my formative years, and I think had like a lot.
So their political power has waned, you would say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, okay.
You know, I think that's been like all of that political energy has like been subsumed first into the UKIP and now the Brexit Party. All sorts of oddballs in the Brexit Party. Honestly, it's embarrassing.
Right.
To have those types of people representing us in Brussels, but that's another story.
But Nick, you had your phone call with him.
Yeah, so I think that like he and his party were like...
Because it was surreal.
Yeah, but he and his party, like let's say 2008, were like hugely influential in changing the mainstream discussion and dragging it to the far right. So for me, it was important to talk to him because I wanted my readers to be able to make a link between what we now understand, like post-recession, as legitimate concerns. Pre-recession, we were like, this is extreme far-right racist rhetoric. And that's the reason I spoke to him. I mean, I think somebody like Nigel Farage is a little bit more like clever with his language, but if he'd given me the opportunity to talk to him, then I would have been able to tease out the racism, I'm sure.
Yeah, but well, Nick didn't have any qualms about it. He was quite clear in his word. And so can you explain to us also this white fear and how that is being expressed
I think that, like,
in the UK's context?
I don't know if any of you like read the broadsheets and all of these white older blokes going on about identity politics, but I think that's a perfect example.
Right.
You know, in Britain, like the journalism is concentrated in London, which is one of the most multicultural areas of the country and also has the vast majority of England's black population, over 1 million people living in London are black, and in some boroughs the percentage is as large as 40%. Yet despite that, the journalism industry is 94% white, despite the fact that it's concentrated in London. Yet when you read these op-eds from these white older male journalists, they're going on like black people are taking over the profession and pushing them out. And it just doesn't tally up with the numbers at all. I think that like culture war, like paranoia that we get from certain columnists is a great example of a fear of a black planet. They're so fearful of being a minority that it's like they can't see the wood for the trees, you know, in terms of like who's actually continues to dominate in their industry.
Yeah.
And I think that like is the case with a lot of the examples that I give in that chapter, you know? There's a big fear of a sense of waning power when the evidence doesn't show that.
And you asked him also what would be wrong if white people were in a minority, right? And what was his response?
Oh, I don't know. I can't remember. It's a long time since I read it.
Wasn't it like, this is a very racist question?
Yeah, I mean, but that's a racist question for somebody who the history of colonization and the British Empire and like the fact that countries like where my heritage is, Nigeria, only got its independence from Britain in the 1960s. None of that stuff factors into his analysis, you know, or any of these people's analysis when it comes to like Britain's place in the world, you know. I think that, and this is just speculation on my part, but not only do they believe that's justified, but they kind of feel that like after Britain went out on its like colonial empire expanding project in which they tried to make, the savages in their own image and likeness, and I, use that with air quotes. They then turn around shocked when people like me are like, this is my country. Of course it is. Like, I mean, you guys were colonizing Nigeria. In fact, Nigeria is a political construction of like British colonialism.
Exactly.
So, yes, I absolutely have a claim to Britain. Thank you very much. That doesn't factor into any of their analysis. And obviously, it's not just Nick Griffin. There's like this.
Well,
there's like this cabal of academics at the moment who are busy trying to like put forward the argument that like colonialism was actually good, and they're pushing the same nonsense as well.
Yeah.
Just 12 years ago, we would have said that was far right, but now that's been taken as serious debate.
It's become mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much like violent whitewashing of the crimes of empire and like this kind of like amnesia of like, gosh, where's this multicultural society come from? I don't know, man. Like 200 years ago, you lot were colonizing everywhere, and now you're mad because we live in London. Do you know what I mean? Like, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Maybe it's time for you to read a bit.
Okay.
Are you ready for that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, great.
I just feel people can't have it all ways, You can't have it both ways. Can't colonize and then be like, get out of my country.
Right.
Okay, so this is a 5-minute read. It's the original blog post. I just wet my whistle. I'm no longer engaging with white people on the topic of race. Not all white people, just the vast majority who refuse to accept the legitimacy of structural racism and its symptoms. I can no longer engage with the gulf of an emotional disconnect that white people display when a person of color articulates their experience. You can see their eyes shut down and harden. It's like treacle is poured into their ears, blocking up their ear canals. It's like they can no longer hear us. This emotional disconnect is the conclusion of living a life oblivious to the fact that their skin color is the norm and all others deviate from it. At best, white people have been taught not to mention that people of color are different in case it offends us. They truly believe that the experiences of their life as a result of their skin color can and should be universal. I just can't engage with the bewilderment and the defensiveness as they try to grapple with the fact that not everyone experiences the world in the way that they do. They've never had to think about what it means in power terms to be white, so anytime they're vaguely reminded of this fact, they interpret it as an affront. Their eyes glaze over in boredom or widen in indignation. Their mouths start twitching as they get defensive. Their throats open up as they try to interrupt, itching to talk over you but not really listen, because they need to let you know that you've got it wrong. The journey towards understanding structural racism still requires people of color to prioritize white feelings. Even if they can hear you, they're not really listening. It's like something happens to the words as they leave our mouths and reach their ears. The words hit a barrier of denial and they don't get any further. That's the emotional disconnect. It's not really surprising because they've never known what it means to embrace a person of color as a true equal with thoughts and feelings that are as valid as their own. Watching The Color of Fear by Lee Manoir, I saw people of color break down in tears as they struggled to convince a defiant white man that his words were enforcing and perpetuating a white racist standard on them. All the while, he stared obliviously, completely confused by this pain, at best trivializing it, at worst ridiculing it. I've written before about this white denial being the ubiquitous politics of race that operates on its inherent invisibility. So I can't talk to white people about race anymore because of the consequent denials, awkward cartwheels, and mental acrobatics that they display when this is brought to their attention. Who really wants to be alerted to a structural system that benefits them at the expense of others? I can no longer have this conversation because they're often coming at it from completely different places. I can't have a conversation with them about the details of a problem if they don't even recognize that the problem exists. Worse still is the white person who might be willing to entertain the possibility of said racism, but who thinks we enter this conversation as equals. We don't. Not to mention that entering into a conversation with defiant white people is frankly a dangerous task for me. As the heckles rise and the defiance grows, I have to tread incredibly carefully because if I express frustration, anger, or exasperation at their refusal to understand, they will tap into their pre-subscribed racist tropes about angry black people who are a threat to them and their safety. It's very likely that they'll then paint me as a bully or an abuser. It's also likely that their white friends will rally around them, rewrite history, and make the lies the truth. Trying to engage with them and navigate their racism is not worth that. Amid every conversation about nice white people feeling silenced by conversations about race, there's a sort of ironic and glaring lack of understanding or empathy for those of us who have been visibly marked out as different for our entire lives and live the consequences. It's truly a lifetime of self-censorship that people of color have to live. The options are speak your truth and face a reprisal, or bite your tongue and get ahead in life. It must be a strange life, always having permission to speak and feeling indignant when you're finally asked to listen. It stems from white people's never questioned entitlement, I suppose. I cannot continue to emotionally exhaust myself trying to get this message across, while also towing a very precarious line that tries not to implicate any one white person in their role of perpetuating structural racism, lest their character assassinate me. So I'm no longer talking to white people about race. I don't have a huge amount of power to change the way the world works, but I can set boundaries. I can halt the entitlement they feel towards me, and I'll start that by stopping the conversation. The balance is too far swung in their favor. Their intent is often not to listen or learn, but to exert their power, to prove me wrong, to emotionally drain me, and to rebalance the status quo. I'm not talking to white people about race unless I absolutely have to. If there's something like a media or conference appearance that means someone might hear what I'm saying and feel less alone, then I'll participate. But I'm no longer dealing with people who don't want to hear it, wish to ridicule it, and frankly, don't deserve it.
How is it to read that back after 5 years? Things have changed. Or have they?
It really depends on how you look at it.
Well,
Take one.
Oh,
Lens.
well, you know, things have changed.
Yeah.
My material conditions have changed. I'm no longer broke as a joke. I've made
Which
money
is
off
great.
writing. That's kind of weird. I didn't expect that. I feel heard. I felt very frustrated at that point. What else? What did I say? Yeah, I mean, I feel like I come across those types of people less and less, but it doesn't mean that they don't want to speak to me. I just avoid them. I'm like ducking and diving to avoid them. I get invitations to talk to people like that all the time in a work context, like to go and talk to them on television and have a big screaming match, and I always say no. So I'm lucky that I get to have a conversation on better terms now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've had interviews with some Dutch journalists. They're probably a little bit more sensitive to how you will respond to them after that one tweet, right?
I did. I sent a tweet. Oh, look, there you go.
Yeah.
Who put this slideshow together? You're exposing me.
Wow.
I did send the tweet.
Like
I did send that
other
tweet.
people saw it, right? But anyway, no, you were also, I mean, this is again you setting boundaries.
I swear, like, I literally sent that tweet. Next thing you know, every Dutch person I knew was like, what?
Yeah.
It's like I
maybe
sent a hand
right?
grenade or something. My apologies.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah. I think we need to educate our journalists somehow, sometimes, in order to also, and in a way you've done that through that tweet. I don't know if that's such a bad thing.
I mean, I am somebody who interviews people and comes from a background of journalism, and I engage with a person's work before I interview them. So I think that journalist probably hadn't read the book. I don't know. But based on the questions, they're just so far away from, like, the book I wrote. So
We have Dutch examples of black female journalists also setting boundaries. We've had that last November, where both Seada Noorhoes and Clarice Cargard, who both wrote op-ed pieces. Well, one said, I'm going to stop altogether, because I'm not being backed by my own newspaper. And the other one basically... because of the amount of racial harassment filed, report at the police. And I think it helped because people sort of woke up and said, oh, wait a minute. And this also nicely ties in, sort of going back to your feminism piece. Again, you also talk about intersectionality quite extensively, right? Which to you is a very useful concept, right? You've talked to Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term in '89. It's been introduced here in the Netherlands in 2001. People found it sometimes too academic, but I think you clearly show in your book, and I guess I've done similar work to how practical the term actually is. It's a prism through which you can look at the world and look at specific types of discrimination and privilege because of the intersections of our identities. Right?
Yeah, but also I kind of feel like, it's very simplistic to just be like, well, feminism's over there and anti-racism is over there, because black women exist. So, like, why are we pretending
You're telling me, but
they
I
don't?
know plenty of people who think that way, right?
It's very strange to me. I mean, have you ever... I grew up pretty working class. It wasn't a surprise to me. It wasn't shocking to me that, like, overwhelmingly, feminists say this a lot, that, like, poverty is feminized, And so why are we pretending that it isn't, and that that feminism and class and, like, conversations about, like, economic disenfranchisement or, like, lack of money, let's just say that instead, are so separate. Especially when it's extra weird to me when we talk about things like gender or ethnicity pay gaps, or the fact that, like, I talk about in the book that black people are more likely to be underemployed. That the fact that they are black means that they're more likely to be working class.
Right.
To me, you can't look at these things independently without seeing the contributing factors that lead to these situations.
Yeah. So you clearly focus also on race and class in one of your chapters, and you talk about gentrification very clearly. You describe some cases in Nottingham. Can you maybe share a little bit about that? Because I think for Rotterdam...
Can you refresh my memory?
Well, notions of gentrification, people being pushed out, because of people being economically disenfranchised, basically.
Or let's just say lack of money. Yeah, simpler term.
Yeah, but I think we have that happening right here in definitely Rotterdam, Rotterdam, but also Amsterdam, the bigger cities, where people are basically being pushed out of this typical neighborhood that used to be sort of lower class and not well kept, and suddenly because of gentrification, because of people coming in with larger pockets, basically with money in them, people are being pushed out, lower class people, basically. And you also speak of the Grenfell Tower as a clear sort of case in point where race, class, and poor living conditions come into this,
I feel like maybe I wrote about that in the afterword, because that happened like 2 weeks after the publication of this book. I mean, it's just traumatizing.
Yeah.
I don't really want to pontificate. It's absolutely traumatizing, and we still are nowhere near any sort of like answers or criminal convictions. To me, like, Grenfell Tower was like an example of multicultural working class London being let down. Not only let down, but left on the wayside to, negligence, criminal negligence.
Basically, Yeah. So, having written this book with an enormous outpour of positive, well, because you were quite surprised, you said about the positive response, right, of your book, more so than you would maybe have hoped or have expected. I don't know, but
I didn't have any expectations.
okay. Yeah.
No, I just sort of thought on publication day, that's it, it's done.
Fact of the matter is, people have been immensely like, oh my God, you wrote my life, you wrote my words. People, it resonates with people.
Yeah, yeah.
Immensely. So, what is it what is it that people come to you for? And does it depend on if they're white or of color?
Some people, they're just looking for guidance, I think, and I can't really give them that. Yeah, you know.
Well, you wrote the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, on these issues, people feel kind of lost, they feel kind of confused, and so I'm asked a lot to lead, I suppose. I don't really want to lead anything. Like, the whole point of being a writer is sort of like standing on the outside and observing and writing down your observations. So I'm very uncomfortable with that idea of like telling people what to do. Just FYI for the Q&A section, don't ask.
Managing some expectations here, but
indeed.
Sure, you're observing and you're writing, and I think that's so important to. First, you gotta become sort of aware of stuff, and also have sort of a list of things that point to that, make your argument stronger. But then, since you're not that leader, is there?
I don't really believe in leaders, you know.
Okay.
Like I saw a good quote from the writer Johan Hari on Twitter the other day, and he said, instead of asking what can I do, you should ask what can we do. I'm interested in working together in collaboration. I'm not really interested in being a leader or even looking to a leader for leadership. I kind of feel like that's defunct at the moment. That whole model is defunct.
Right.
Okay.
Bless you.
Fair enough. And what is next then, after this?
Oh, I don't know. It's been like 2 years now.
Or you're still riding the wave of success here?
I am actually writing, but I haven't sold any books. I haven't sold any ideas to anyone. I'm just doing my own private writing. What's next? I don't know. Just continue to look at the world and take notes and think about it, you know.
Do you feel a responsibility now, or not at all? You're like
a responsibility to.
Well, you know, in a way, you set the tone. Well, somebody said you've changed the way we talk about or look at. Yeah, that's the book that's changing how we talk about race.
I mean, that's the book. It's not me. So the book has a responsibility, but the book is separate from me. So
the artist has made their art, and so for the consumer to do with it what will.
Indeed, yes.
All right. Well, so, maybe we should then check out our consumers. Should we go to the Q&A? What do you think?
If anybody else has questions, now's the time.
I am actually quite curious. I mean, I have more questions, but it's kind of like, this feels like a moment for you to weigh in, dear audience, because you also want to have her sign your book, and since this is a big crowd, there's going to be a long line, so you know, there's still work to be done. Are there any questions? And, are there any questions? Don't make it a long, you know, spoken essay, just state your case, and I see 2 hands over there. Yeah, and also maybe say your name. That would be nice. And stand up so we can see you.
A lot of questions. Yes.
Hi. I'm Adrienne. I was talking about the book with a friend, and then we came to the topic that a lot of people, when we talked about the book, they said, yeah, but there's also racism against white people. I wanted to know what you thought, because our discussion came because we were reading your book what do you, as the author of that book, think of?
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you yourself?
Is there any racism against white people? Okay. Is that something? Is that not? I've read some posts.
Well, what do you think
online?
I'm going to say?
I was going to,
I started. I went to read the definition of. We were just talking about the definition of racism and came to the conclusion that there was prejudice because racism is linked to power, and that there's not really, if it's against a white person, it's not really a problem of power, like we don't have any influence on the life of the person we're against. So that happened in my school, for example, where the majority was black, whatever color you would call me. And there was one white person, but by nagging that person, bullying that person, you didn't mean being racist to that person. So, I don't know. The debate just, we don't know.
It's not nice to bully.
No.
No. I don't endorse bullying, just putting
And
it
then
out there.
second question, so I don't need to maybe ask twice. What was it again? Yeah, no, I just wanted to know what was one of the most interesting comments against your book that you read? Because you probably received a lot of comments, a lot of people against, a lot of people for. But what, as a person, you felt like thinking twice? Because the comments seemed very, very strong and very, yeah, there's probably one that was against you, but was interesting to read.
Oh, well,
what was it?
I kind of like have a rule with myself that I don't go out seeking criticism, because then you just find yourself in, then you like just upset yourself for no reason. But I think one of the most interesting, I don't really listen to the criticism of people who politically just disagree with me anyway, because what's the point? But for people who I'm largely on the same page with, I do tune in. And I think one of the most interesting critiques that I heard was somebody who pointed out to me that I hadn't picked up the anti-Semitic dog whistles in Nick Griffin's interview, and that really made me reflect on the tradition of anti-racism I come from, and why a sharp analysis of what anti-Semitism is was just not embedded into that, and then just sent me off to go off and, that sent me down a little spiral of reading books and sort of educating myself and sort of questioning the anti-racist movement that I came from, and yeah, so that's what I'd say.
Good one. Okay, I saw a hand over here. Then the mic. No. Sorry? Yeah, there. Oh, okay, cool.
Thanks very much. So a quick question about intersectionality that was mentioned earlier on. I believe that you distance yourself from the notion and from the academic scholarship and that, but maybe I'm misunderstanding either the way you're approaching the issue of race or how Crenshaw is doing that, but I just want a point of clarification. The way I understand intersectionality is actually the convergence of race and sexuality and gender and a couple of and class and a couple of other issues, and that's also how I understand your argument. Or would you say that those are, you don't look at the convergence, but you want to actually approach race as a standalone issue?
Oh, I think that your first comment is where I'm coming from, yes, if that makes sense. I'm not really trying to look at racism as a standalone issue. I don't think that I'm really able to, which is why in the book there's a chapter that it speaks about race and feminism, and there's a chapter that speaks to race and class in particular. So yeah, it's about the convergence. And I mean, I distance myself because, I think I'm a smart person, but sometimes I don't really understand academic texts, and I think that's a problem. So I kind of see and I read academic texts, and it informs my work, but I kind of see my job as a person who writes in a more commercial space to, I don't know, continue to work on ideas in a way that's as accessible as possible. But yeah, if you want to ask, do I subscribe to Crenshaw's analysis? I do, and I definitely cite her in the book on that. So.
Yeah, I think you actually clearly do intersect very clearly, and you try to also unpack that. You take the time for it, you have the patience for it, so that's actually what I think is important.
I also feel like it was important to define in the book because, well, first off, there's so much rubbish and lies and nonsense and misinformation about intersectionality out there at the moment, and not many people are taking the time to go off and read Kimberly Crenshaw's initial text, mapping the margins and stuff back in '89. And to be fair, it's not like they're widely in publication, So for me, it was important to just put her clear definition in the book for everybody to see. Yeah.
Clear. Does that help? All right. So there was someone there. Okay, great. Hey, you. Can we get the mic over there?
Hi.
So who are you?
Tiana Vostermama. And I'm clearly English, but I've lived in the Netherlands a long time. And I'm just curious, because you mentioned I was also around in feminist groups in England in the 80s. And I'm just curious, because when you're talking about your experience of being with feminists, it makes it seem like you're alone as a black woman. And I was just curious, what kind of support have you got from black feminists? Were there any other black feminists involved? Like, quite often when I was at university, we had Black Feminist Caucus, which also had its own issues. But there was that group. And what would you say about the black feminist movement in London now? And what kind of support do you get? I'm just curious about that. You could say something about that.
Okay, it's a good question. I mean, I'm 30, so I physically wasn't around in the 80s. Like, so I can't speak to being around at the time, but I can say that, and I write about it in the book as well, that the way that I combated that behavior was through a group that I was involved in called Black Feminists. And I also interview one of the women who was part of the group
Was that
in the
Jessica?
book. Oh no, that's Lola.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, well, maybe it comes across as me saying as though I was alone, but I always went back to black feminists and complained copiously with them about the behavior we were on the receiving end of, and yeah, so I definitely wasn't alone.
So you would also say that's kind of your support group or your go-to.
Yeah, I mean, I write about in the chapter specifically about feminism. If I can find it. Yeah, look, here we go. In my activist days, I joined a small group named Black Feminists, so I could speak my truth in a collective full of like-minded women without fear of social punishment. This is a space solely for women of color. We met once a month to vent and support each other. It was a space I desperately needed. And then I just talk a little bit about meeting with them every month and how it wasn't like the old school feminist activist method of consciousness raising. And, I speak to Lola Okolosi about sort of our time in there. So, But yeah, I mean, in terms of like speaking publicly about the group, I guess I don't want to speak on behalf of anybody but myself when I'm talking about the clashes, But yeah.
That makes sense, yeah. All right. More questions or right over there. And tell us your name.
Hi, my name's Rocher, and I have a question regarding intersectionality as well. I was wondering what's your take on racism and homophobia and racism and transphobia, because, for instance, black trans women get murdered a lot as well as the biggest form of violence regarding transphobia and homophobia.
My take is, yes, I agree. I don't really have any more to add, but yeah. It's a travesty.
Would you write more about it if you would write a next book about this topic, for instance?
Maybe, although, I'll think about it. Yeah, I'll think about it.
Because it's kind of not there, right?
Yeah.
There's so much to talk
But
about.
I kind of felt like it wasn't my place.
Right. Okay.
Because, well, I'm not like a public LGBT person. Do you know what I mean? So I didn't really feel like it was my place. But maybe my job is to sort of like signal boost the queer writers and the black queer writers who I know who are doing interesting work. So.
Yeah. To interview them maybe also. More questions. Ladies in the front maybe? No? Surya? Are you ready for a question, maybe? I think you are. You're still churning on it?
Okay, we've got other questions.
There's two hands here, and oh, there you go. Hi, what's your name?
Hello, my name is Sevge. I come from like Turkish and Kurdish background, and I'm really trying to like engage in anti-racism, but then merely like focused on my own ethnic or religious group. But sometimes I really don't know how to do it without taking like too much space. As you talked about, like it's not really my place to say something about LGBTQI. Could you maybe give some recommendations or any tips?
Well, you said that you were focusing in like, you know, your group or... So for me, I mean, speaking up about queer stuff means not speaking on behalf of all queer people in the public sphere, but rather challenging it in like the anti-racist and feminist groups that I'm in. I think particularly transphobia, because it's very rife in British feminism at the moment, you know, because I feel like that's where I'm heard. But because I'm not trans, I don't really feel like it's my place to speak about the ills of transphobia like in a public-facing way, but I feel like in my community, I challenge it, and let me tell you, it's tough because the transphobia is wild out there. It's absolutely wild. But then at the same time, I also feel like it's my role to, when the situation calls for it, to also challenge these things publicly as well, you know, because I'm getting off the topic now. But basically, I guess that's what I would suggest that, you know, you do in your position as well. Challenge the people for whom you have influence in. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm getting a bit tired now, guys, but...
Okay. So a hand here and somewhere there in the middle. Don't know who was first, but yeah. Yeah, but wait.
We've got a microphone.
Just for the mic.
Hello. My name is Gerrit Verstegen. I'm married to a Chinese woman. I have 2 children, a girl and a boy. And the boy has really Chinese eyes and white skin. And my daughter has dark skin and not blue, but really Western eyes. And I like to know when I'm crossing the line of racism, because I have a lot of discussions in the past with my children, with my wife. For example, my son is said he is chased by the police because he looks Chinese. And then he has a lot of Moroccan friends and also Dutch friends. And the Dutch friends maybe are not chased by the police, but he is always chased by the police. I sometimes tell him, you know, you have already a preconception that they will chase you because you look Chinese. Is that true? Am I crossing the line of racism then?
I think you could probably demonstrate more empathy with his position. You could definitely. I think especially if you're his dad, like, he needs you to hear his distress, not side with the police in that situation, you know. So I mean, look, I don't want to interfere in your parenting, but I would say just think carefully about who you have an obligation to there, you know, because I imagine it would be incredibly painful for him to turn to you, recount an incident like that, and for you to say, well, think about how the police feel. Or, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but, you know, in terms of his distress, I think just empathize and allow him to speak to you about it with no preconceptions. That's what I'd say.
Mm. Yeah. You actually talk about a similar case in your book, where the daughter, son of color, has all these debates, discussions with their white parent because the lack of empathy is very distressful, actually.
Mm.
So it's kind of your child is educating you as a parent, in a sense, which I thought was such a painful passage because, it's, I mean, how much do you do in terms of, listening to your own child and what is happening there. I mean, it's heartbreaking, of course. Well, good luck to you. Next question. There and there. I was you with first, and then we'll go to you. Right in the middle there. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm holding it. Oh, sorry. Hi, my name is Flor, and I was just wondering if you could speak again about the title and how you feel about the translation of it. That it's why I'm no longer talking about racism to white people rather than race.
Do you have feelings about it?
I mean, I just learned about it, so
Okay.
I was just wondering if you have any
Not really.
thoughts on it.
I mean, I kind of feel like racism is a good fit. Why I'm no longer talking to white people about racism, because
you approved it, basically.
Yeah.
Let's be clear about the fact that you approved the Dutch. It was explained to you, and you said, "Let's go."
Yeah, but I also kind of feel like the book is more about racism than it is to do with race.
In the end.
Yeah. So, race itself is a fallacious social construct with no biological basis in reality.
Race is a construct. Racism exists.
Yeah, racism is the reality. So, I don't really have any strong feelings about it, to be honest.
You're good with it. Question over here. Right in the front. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks. Actually, it's not a question. Okay, I can.
I'm going to hold it.
Okay.
What's
So
your
sweet
name?
of you. Hello, my name is Azar. Actually, it's not a question. It's a kind of common I want to ask the white people or Dutch people who are here to stop asking this question. Where are you from? So I've been living here for 5 years.
So there's a free tip for everyone in the room. Thank you. That's so generous.
Each and every day I'm facing this. And it is not a kind of racism. I know that it might be kind of out of curiosity. But I can remember 3-4 years ago, my boyfriend who's been living here for 20 and 3-4 years, and he speaks native Dutch. We met a woman in Greece, and she was Dutch. And they started to speak native Dutch together. And the woman asked, "Where are you from?" And he replied, "Delft, a city in the Netherlands." And she again asked, "No, where are you from?"
Yeah.
He asked,
Where are you really from?
Yes. He said, "Delft." She said, "No, where are you?" And he was like, "Okay, Iran, my
So
granddad."
who has had that experience here in the room? Right?
Many people. Okay.
Let's not do that anymore. Okay, thank
cool.
you. Thanks for the
Public
tip.
service announcement.
Do you have that in
Oh, yeah, I mean, it
right?
happens, but...
All the time, right. Yes, I see a question. Oh, can we do that? Okay, yeah, you want to, go ahead, please.
You write in your book about that the society changes faster than politics, than leadership, than how countries are being governed. And recently in the Netherlands, and probably in other countries as well, there was a discussion about overrepresentation of men in, for example, top business positions. And the question comes for quota. How do you look at that when we talk about color and positions of people? Could that be a solution as well?
Well, I'm not really one for doing policy proposals, which is why I've chosen not to be a politician. But I think that when we speak about quotas, we have to also point to the informal quotas that have existed in such a way to lead to the overrepresentation of men in the first place. And so, given that there have been informal quotas, perhaps not even named as such, that have led us to a situation where we consider merit to be inhabited in the body of an older white guy, reflected in most of our positions of power, then I think it stands to reason that you could understand why people would try to propose quotas to challenge that. So, but personally, like, I mean, in the book I speak extensively about, like, why I think opposition to quotas comes from a really like politically dodgy place. But I stop short of saying we should all have them or we should not have them, because I don't know, I just don't really want to do policy proposals.
But you do follow politics as a journalist.
Oh yeah, avidly.
It's October, and what do you think? Is Brexit going to happen or not?
I don't think it's going to happen, to be honest with you.
Because why not?
Because I just don't think that Boris will get it past Parliament. I just don't think he will. Theresa May wasn't successful, and I know that Boris is trying to remodel himself as like some kind of Donald Trump-style tyrant, and he's just going to run roughshod over the law, the Constitution, and Parliament. But I don't think that he'll be able to get away with it. So I don't think it's going to happen. Also, it's going to like throw the economy into like total free fall. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't know.
Well, it's also because the Dutch...
I mean, not on October the 31st. I'm sure it'll happen eventually, but...
Oh, at some point.
Yeah,
okay.
but just not on October the 31st.
Yeah. Well, the Dutch press loves to talk about it all the time. It's very boring. But it's also very technical.
I mean, think about how we feel.
I know.
God.
I empathize.
I stopped listening to the morning news.
Right? But it's all very technical. But race plays such a vital role. There's a huge gap. I mean, it's not being talked about in terms of race. What would you say about what it means in terms of race, Brexit?
Oh, really? Oh, I don't know. There's the xenophobia, there's the legitimate concerns, there's this belief that ending freedom of movement is going to bring back jobs to people, and it's a big mess. I don't want to talk about Brexit.
Let's end on a positive note then.
Yeah. Brexit is not a positive note.
What is a positive note for you?
I don't know.
I think the positive note here is, well, you first of all writing this book, but then also the huge resonance that it has internationally. It's been also translated in German. It's been
French, German, Swedish.
Right. So it's
Brazilian,
going
Portuguese.
through Europe. And I think it's so important in this dire place called Europe to speak about these things. So in a way, your book gives us hope, I think.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
Because people are always looking to me, can you give us something to be hopeful for? So
Well, you did it. You gave us
there
the
you go.
book.
So don't
And the
ask
rest
me,
is
guys.
up to us. Give her a big hand. Reni
Thanks,
Eddo-Lodge.
everyone.